It's about participating in my life. It's a way to figure out who I am. It's a way to analyze my relationship with the world around me. I do think that you can reach these meditative states because I think as human beings, we've only spent a matter of hundreds of years in these constructed environments, right? And like what we have evolved to do is be in these natural environments.
The Urban Exodus podcast shares the wisdom, wit, and stories of those who decided to embark on the road less traveled, to pursue their own interpretation of the good life. Small business owners, change makers, artists, farmers, and more, working towards building a better future for themselves and their fellow citizens. The people I've met through this project give me energy and hope for a better future. May their inspirational words and practical advice embolden and guide you on your own journey. This podcast is for country dreamers, rural folk, and urban dwellers alike who want to feel more connected to the natural world and the purpose and choices in their lives. I'm Melissa Hessler. Welcome to the Urban Exodus. Urban Exodus is a labor of love and is only made possible by listener support. To support our programming, please consider making a listener contribution or joining our Patreon community for access to bonus features, rapid-fire interviews, videos, and so much more. I'm so excited to invite you to my conversation with modern-day Renaissance man Jonathan Wilkins. Jonathan is a former firefighter and landscape designer turned professional hunter, outdoor guide, chef, podcaster, historian, musician, and writer. Currently, Jonathan operates Black Duck Revival, a hunting lodge in Brinkley, Arkansas, where he offers stays, excursions, and educational experiences. The business came out of a desire to bring together hunters of all backgrounds and experiences to support and learn from one another. Jonathan grew up in the city and started hunting, fishing, and foraging as an adult. He immediately fell in love with learning different historic and modern processes to acquire wild food. Hunting has strengthened Jonathan's connection with the natural world, and he is passionate about encouraging others to reclaim their own self-sufficiency. In our conversation, we speak about embracing discomfort to expand your horizons, the meditative and healing benefits of hunting, advice for anyone wanting to hunt, catch, or forage wild food, and how to build mutual respect and community in a rural area. This is a story about participating fully in your life, turning your passion into your profession, growth through challenge, and the value of integrative self-reliance. So I am so excited to invite to the show today Jonathan Wilkins. Jonathan Wilkins is the founder of Black Duck Revival, which is a podcast, it's a website, it is also a place to stay and like workshop services. We'll go deep into Black Duck Revival, but I'm really excited to have Jonathan on the show. Not only is Jonathan an avid hunter, but he's also an absolutely gifted writer. And I'll be reading some of the passages of things that he's written in the past, and we'll be talking about it. But first off, welcome to the show, Jonathan. We've already been talking a little bit, and I just have loved speaking to you thus far, and so I had to turn the tape on. First, I'd love if you would share a little bit of your personal backstory, where you grew up, your work, and what it's looked like up to this point, and how you got to where you are now.
Yeah, so I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri. Both of my parents are educators. My dad was a grade school teacher for most of my life. My mom was a school teacher and principal and college professor. I ended up in Arkansas when I was 18. I went to the small liberal arts school. Went there, dropped out, finished up, and then just kind of focused my studies in history, race relations, sociology, stuff like that. I played music for a long time, semi-professionally. So a lot of my working career was kind of based around that being in mind. So just jobs I could quit or jobs that would give me time off. So doing that, I've always kind of worked like these blue collar jobs. So construction and building stuff, roofing, working in kitchens a lot, which I very much consider a blue collar job. It's hot and sweaty and lifting heavy stuff and getting burned and cutting fingertips off and all that kind of jazz. But, a lot of the same kind of a culture too, like, very largely masculine environments, lots of yelling and rough talk and tattoos and cigarettes and folks going in and out of jail and all that kind of stuff. And I had a restaurant, like a small restaurant operation for a little bit. I helped develop some restaurants. Like the last kind of real job I had was I was a professional firefighter, like a structure firefighter in Little Rock, just like fighting house fires and, being an EMT. In my mid to late 20s, I was introduced to hunting, just kind of like immediately fell into it, like really intensively. And then about 5 years ago, I bought an old dilapidated church in Arkansas Delta. And I was originally, it was just going to be like a camp for me and my buddies and stuff. I was tired of driving so far. The renovations it was really, once I started peeling the layers back, it was pretty close to a tear down. But I was trying to figure out a way not to lose my ass on it financially. So my wife and I came up with this idea of like, fix it up, get it how we would want it to be for us and our family to be there. And then when I'm not hunting, I could kind of Airbnb it out to other duck countries, because Arkansas, especially East Arkansas and the Delta, is a point of travel. It's kind of like a holy grail spot for American duck hunters because of flooded timber largely. So I did that for a couple of years. And then I put this event on called The Revival, which was basically just an excuse to hang out with people I thought were cool. So I invited folks kind of in the space that I thought were interesting or had unique perspectives, took them on a couple of hunts, cooked, kind of shared our experiences, hung out, all that stuff. And it went really well and felt like a pretty resonant experience. And it just kind of, I guess kind of this eureka moment where all these things that I had, these skills and these abilities and these points of interest I had accumulated over the years. So like working with my hands, cooking, hunting, fishing, wild foods, thinking about that stuff, the philosophy of it all, some of those kind of tenets of Western intellectual tradition, like all kind of seem like a place where they all kind of work together. And so then I was like, man, I'm going to try and make this what I'm doing. Fighting fire was no longer satisfying to me. So I left that and just kind of leaned into this full bore. And so I've been doing that for a couple of years now. And then it seems like it's been fairly well received. It's gotten a little bit of attention, writing opportunities. And so folks written some magazine articles about it and little, small documentaries and whatnot. And yeah, now I do that. And, so we do like some waterfowl stuff. We do fishing trips in the spring. We do like some kind of culinary workshop type things. And then I write, and like you said, I've got this podcast, and now I'm starting to travel around the country and give kind of lectures, demonstrations.
It's always really inspiring to me when I meet people who are able to figure out a way to take their passion, the thing that they love the most, and like figure out how they create kind of an ecosystem, a life around that passion that can also support them as well. And I know that is no easy feat in any respect of the word. And you are a real Renaissance man. I mean, you had all of these different jobs, all of these different careers, and it seems like Black Duck Revival is almost a culmination of all of those skills. And I'd love for you to just kind of talk about how you overcame any feelings of uncertainty or fear about taking this kind of big leap into the next thing.
I mean, I'd be lying to you if I told you I'd overcome them. Like I'm racked with self-doubt constantly. I think that if I do have any sort of a skill set, that like one of those things would be that I do stuff even when it's scary and hard, right? I'm willing to like fail, lick my wounds, and then try again. I think anyone who tells you like that they don't care what other people think is a liar, right? Like, I feel like that's one of the battles in my life is I think a lot of people perceive me as a person who doesn't care what other people think, but like, I'm like everybody else, I want people to think I'm cool and successful, and, I want to feel that way about myself, and I'm constantly at odds with that. But what I have seen is the things that people think are cool about me are all the results of just me being willing to do stuff or try to do stuff that's difficult for me, and then fail, and then try it again and fail until you either figure out it's not for you, or you figure out how to make it work. And I think it's important too to find ways to make things work for you. So I feel like everything I do is kind of very particular to me. It's informed by other stuff. Like the way I play guitar, most people that heard me play, like, it was recognizable that I was the one playing, right? Same way I run a duck call. I learned to run a duck call in a kind of a non-traditional way, and it's still effective and it still works. There'd be a lot of people that might tell you that it's not the way, but I mean, I've got enough ducks in my freezer to tell you that it works, so.
All of those pieces were such good advice, because it's basically like, be true to yourself, right? Like, you're creating something that is new and it's individual to yourself. So you aren't comparing yourself to others. And your ability to just try things that maybe are scary or that you've never done before, and be okay with failing and then picking yourself back up and trying them again. And I think that that's like the repeated advice that I hear from so many people who are starting things on their own. And in that same regard, most of them, even like, 5, 8, 10 years into their business, are still like, I have no idea what I'm doing. And I'm still not sure if this is going to work, right? And just knowing that that's also normal. And you're going to go through these high points and these low points as you go. So let's go back to kind of the beginning stages of your story. So you were living in St. Louis, you were a city boy, you hadn't ever hunted before, you went to college, you met your partner, and you moved to Arkansas. Or were you in Arkansas for school? You were.
Yeah, I was already in Arkansas.
So your neighbor taught you first bow hunting, right? Is that correct?
It wasn't my neighbor, just like a buddy of mine. Yeah, we were like building decks and fences and stuff together. We're married now. My wife, at the time, my girlfriend, she had decided to move back to like where she had grown up, like this 15 acres outside of Little Rock. I was just kind of mesmerized because I had never really seen deer in close proximity. I didn't understand that like squirrels in the woods act different than squirrels in parks. Like they don't come up to you, they run
Not
away.
as aggressive.
It's hard to get close to them.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, like the squirrels in the woods act like prey animals, and squirrels in parks act like,
Yes.
habituated creatures. Yeah. So just all of that kind of stuff. And so I started squirrel hunting a little bit with him. He kind of taught me the basics of like how to find deer sign. I watched a bunch of videos. I got a bow. There's a lot of luck involved in this too. Like I killed my first deer with a bow like 2 weeks after I got a bow.
Wow.
Which is
That's
kind of unheard of.
Yeah.
Yeah. And like I said, there's a lot of luck involved in that, like some skill, but a lot of luck. And I think having some early success just gave me some confidence. And yeah. And so then I just I fell into it just full bore. Like I said, I had this lifestyle set up to where, I had kind of traded like financial stability for, freedom, just ability to do what I wanted to. So I could go hunting a whole lot, and I could read a whole bunch and just really try and learn as much as possible. So it kind of cut my learning curve down. And I felt like I had reached, a level of decent proficiency with some of that stuff after, 3 or 4 years.
I have a lot of friends who hunt. They hunt first and foremost to fill their freezers with deer meat for the winter. And usually secondly is to control the tick population in Maine, which is a real problem. But lastly, they all kind of say that this like great peace and meditation that they get hunting, almost like just being out in the woods, is one of the biggest gifts that they get from hunting. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, aside from the food and the skills that you've learned, what gifts does hunting give you?
Yeah, so I'd actually probably look, a lot of people talk about the food first because that's more palatable to folks, right? I don't think that's why most people are hunting. Because if it was purely a food thing, they'd raise an animal, right? Or they would be just more intimately plugged into these kind of like small farm connections and stuff, right? They're participating in something that is innately human. And I think that's what people are responding to. I'd say to me, it's about participating in my life. It's a way to figure out who I am. It's a way to analyze my relationship with the world around me, with the people around me, with the animals around me, the flora and the fauna. I do think that you can reach these meditative states because I think as human beings, we've only spent a matter of hundreds of years in these constructed environments, right? And like what we have evolved to do is be in these natural environments. And I think that kind of keying in to the idea, if done with the way that I think it's the right way to do it, if you start keying into these natural processes and your part in those processes, I think that's where kind of the meditation, the relaxation, and the ability to breathe comes in, because that's like a natural state. I think this stuff is as natural as like carrying children and birth and living and dying and loving and hating and all that stuff, right? These are like foundational human experiences. I didn't come up with this. I've heard other people talk about it too, but it's like, I feel like if you try and, refine what human experience about, it's all based around like fighting and feeding. And then, another F word we're all familiar with, right? And by that, I mean, like, these are all things that I think are foundational to what it means to be a human being. And they can all be like the absolute peaks of expression of humanity, as well as like the lowest pits of it, right? Your grandma can make you chicken noodle soup, right? And that can like sustain you physically. It can sustain your spirit. You can carry those smells and those associations for the rest of your life, right? You can also just fall into, gluttony and just live off of gas station burritos all the time, or not have access to food, right? And you can experience it that way. Same thing with fighting, right? Like, I think there's nobility in struggle. This doesn't have to be physical fighting, but like struggling for a noble cause, right? And then you have the result, the opposite of that, of like dominion over other people and imposing yourself and hurting other people, right? Same thing with like physical expressions of love, right? You can make a child, you can reach the depths of depravity with it as well. So I think that really that's what people are responding to. And if I'm really being honest, as central as the food is to it, I would put the food part of it at least equal with all of that stuff I just talked about.
I've never had it explained in such a way, and it makes so much sense. It's that primordial root. Like, we were all, at one point, we were all hunter-gatherers. This is how we survived as a species. And we've become so detached from that through these conveniences that we've added into our society. And so in some ways, it's like a reconnecting to what it means to be human, right?
Yeah. I mean, that's part of this whole, like, it's part of the revival idea of like the name for I guess it's a brand now, right? That's obviously a reference to the fact that this building used to be a church, but it's also this idea of like this reviving or this rediscovery. Like I said, these natural processes, which I think are important. It's having some connection to where your sustenance comes from. It's working with your hands. It's accepting failure as a necessary part of your life experience, right? I'm not looking for success every time I go into the woods. Even though I've entered this kind of, I wouldn't really call it commercial hunting, but I mean, there's money changing hands, so I guess it is, right? Even that, I've had to really negotiate with myself about like the level to which I want to participate in it, right? So, but like what I offer is like a strange kind of experience, because even though, I mean, people are paying good money to come, and I want them to have good quality, successful hunts. I want them to see lots of animals. I want them to have the opportunity to harvest animals, or, to be frank, to kill animals so that they can take them home and eat them. I don't base my success on like getting limits, right? Oftentimes we're not going to get limits because I'm dealing with people that aren't expert shots, right? So there has to be value in the experience well beyond that. And then also, when you bring the idea of food into it, you bring the idea of a respectful, ethical, cost-effective way of dealing with these wild protein sources. Then you start to stack up all these layers of value into it to where the whole experience becomes something, that is transformative, right? It becomes participatory instead of exploitive. It can become, at its best, like a reverent expression of humanity, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like, I think the pandemic had a hand in it, but I think that just like the uncertain state of the world as a whole right now is really making people reevaluate just supply chain shortages. Like all of these things, people are all of a sudden starting to realize the vulnerabilities of these systems of convenience that we have lived within for the last couple of generations. But it wasn't that long ago. These were ordinary practices that everybody did. Like everybody participated in these things because that's how they survived. And in a beautiful article that you wrote that I'm going to link to with this podcast episode, I just pulled some passages from it because, like I said to you earlier when we were speaking before we started recording, you have such a way with words. I have seen many people who are desperate for a place where they can learn how we used to live. And many still do, even just a generation or two ago, when we had bodies that moved with honest strength of physical labor, when we repurposed and reused and did for ourselves, when we grew food and hunted for sustenance in wild places, when we cooked our own food. Hopefully, the story of Black Duck Revival can serve as an example to like-minded folks to show that a lack of knowledge is not the same as a lack of ability. Effort is a great equalizer, and surrounding yourself with people who know more than you is the closest thing to a shortcut we find as we make our way in the world. And this passage is just so true and moving to me. And like we said, there's this growing kind of desire to reconnect to that. And I'd love for you to give your advice to anyone who wants to learn how to provide more for themselves and their loved ones on the best ways to get started on that path towards greater self-reliance, no matter where they are.
All right. So I'd say like the first thing you got to do is you got to get comfortable with kind of leaning into discomfort, right? And that could be like physical discomfort. That can be the fear of not knowing, the fear of the dark. Because like a lot of times when you're hunting, you're going to be entering places, you're going to be entering the woods in the dark. And it's just different, it's different and it's kind of scarier until you get used to it. And I think you need to, this sounds a little bit harsh, but I think you got to stop being a baby about stuff, right? So, and by that, I mean, there's a lot of people that go out and hunt, right? They kill stuff. And then they shrug off all the evisceration and the turning that thing into meat to somebody else, right? And I've never had somebody else process an animal for me, right? If you cut an animal open and you eviscerate it, it smells funky because that's what animals are made out of. And I think that's part of it, right? You need to enter it with the understanding that it's going to be uncomfortable, right? And it's okay to be uncomfortable, right? All the big stuff in life is. I mean, I've watched my wife carry and deliver 2 children. Buddy, it's messy, right? And it's difficult and painful in a way that I can't understand or comprehend. But I very much think that it's part of what makes that magical moment when the babies were placed in her arms, like magic, right? So like, get all right with that. Okay. And then just start where you are. Let's say you just live in a condo or something, right? And you've got a balcony. Go get a couple of 5-gallon buckets and go to Lowe's and get some soil in there and start growing some tomatoes or like some peppers. Anything, man. There's a difference in it. There really is. There's a difference in going and taking that pepper off and chopping it up and incorporating it into, whatever you're going to make. There's a difference in that and going to the store and getting it. There's a profound difference in cooking protein that you saw the process start to finish through, right? You're not like I'm real pointed with this about this to people. Like if I gift you a duck or some deer meat or, bear meat or whatever, right? And I get any hint that you've wasted this or you've thrown it away or whatever, like it'll affect our relationship, right? One, you'll never get any of it again, but it'll definitely affect our relationship because you're devaluing something that I place an immense amount of value on. Right? I value the experience in it. Like if I give you that, you're going to get a story about where it came from, all of that, right? A lot of people get into having to have the latest and greatest gear. I'll give you a perfect example about this. I bought a very entry-level bow 11 years ago that I killed my first deer with. I don't know, a few $100s I guess I spent on it. And Every animal I've ever harvested with a bow, I've killed with that exact same bow. I haven't had to go and get a new one and a new one and a new one. So yeah, I think most of it's mindset. And then I would really encourage people to find some sort of mentorship. Like, real talk, it's going to be few and far between a person who has no relationship to anybody else that's more knowledgeable about this stuff and just reaches a level of proficiency. So if you don't have that, like in a familial sort of way or a friendship sort of way, there's more organizations now than there's ever been that are great places to start to build those relationships. Those would be stuff like backcountry hunters and anglers for, folks that are considered non-traditional. You have like Artemis sportswomen. You've got Hunters of Color. You've got the Minority Outdoor Alliance. There's like my buddy down in Texas, Jesse Griffiths, who's like a well-known restaurateur. He offers these really awesome classes where you can go and hunt deer and hogs and do these like full butchery courses, black duck revival. I mean, like whatever. There's all these places you can go to. Like, just remember that like everybody, we're conducting an interview right now on it. Like, we're carrying around supercomputers. You've got the Library of Alexandria in your pocket. Just start looking, and you'll find people participating in these activities that you find off-putting. You don't like how they're doing it. You don't like their messaging. You don't like their style, any of that stuff. Don't interact with those people. Find the people that are working from an ethos that you can get behind, and then, work your way into it, right?
I work in the photo world, so I apply so much of that to my own advice that I give to people who are interested in going into photography. And it's the exact same advice. It's like, find the people that are doing the stuff that you love. And it isn't about the gear. I think that that's such a barrier of entry that people feel because we like hype up the best gear, like the amount of email inquiries that I get for people who want to know what the best camera is. And I'm like, hey, you got a camera right here. It's about like the practice and the skill and finding the mentorship and finding people who have been doing it for way longer than you. And so you can kind of like absorb pieces of what they do and maybe try your own things too to add to it. So that's really great advice and applicable to so many different things.
And work hard. I'd say that real quick too, if I could add it. Like, work hard. I've dealt with folks that are, they want to learn about hunting, right? And so like, I take them hunting. I talk to them on the phone for a long time. I invest all this time into them. And really what they are is dilettantes, right? And like, I don't mess with those people anymore, right? If I'm going to give you my time, whatever expertise I've acquired, like, make it worthwhile. And if you just want to kind of like be voyeuristic, that's totally fine too. But just do that and don't impose upon other people's time and effort, right? And yeah, like what you're saying with photography is so right on, because like I deal a lot with photography now just because of writing and doing stuff for the screen and content. And I mean, it's real easy to get a $12,000 photo rig. You start getting into these lenses and all that other stuff. What really makes interesting photos, in my estimation, is the photographer's eye, like their understanding of texture, right? And then bringing a perspective to it. Because, man, look, there's a million people that take really cool photos of wildlife. And they're not all. They're largely very forgettable, right? What happens is someone with an interesting perspective and a cool eye puts their stuff out there, and then everybody copies that until the next person that's cool and interesting brings something that's totally different, right?
I wonder what benefits and drawbacks you think you've experienced learning about the wild food space as an adult versus a child, because I know a lot of people come into hunting when they're younger, and I wonder if you've ever really thought about like the benefits of learning it as you're older.
I mean, I think the only real drawback would be that less time to experience it. Like, I just wish I'd had an extra, 10 or 15 years of getting to do it. I think there's real benefit to doing it as an adult, because then you get to decide how you're going to do it, right? So like, most people learn to hunt, and I mean, this is largely a thing that's passed down from fathers to sons, right? And so you learn to hunt the way your daddy did. That might not even be a way that's necessarily legal anymore, right? I've seen plenty of that. So, and then what happens is then it becomes this thing to where like there's only one way to do it because that's the way we've always done it. Like, I feel like it's a strength for me. I mean, there's tons of people that are better hunters than I am, but I'm a better hunter than a whole lot of people that have done it their whole lives because I put more work into it. I put a lot of time into it. I put a lot of effort into it. There's a tremendous amount of value in understanding seasonality. And the only way to experience that is just to experience it. That's how you understand it, right? Just year after year, season after season, started to see these cycles. Like Aldo Leopold wrote this very formative book, the St. County Almanac. And that book is, I mean, the North American conservation model is based in a large part influenced by that book. And that book is written by seasons. And so it's in a book, so it's linear, but really you're talking about something that's cyclical. So that's something that you just have to, that's a point you get to with successive years of doing it. But I mean, say you're a college professor and you got sabbatical coming up and you're 45 years old and you're like, I'm going to spend this entire semester just with as many days in the field as possible. Like you'll figure a whole bunch of stuff out, about yourself, about the woods, about animals, your skill level will go up, your ability, your eye. Like I used to think I couldn't understand how people could just see a bird flying far away and identify that bird, and now I can be inside of the lodge and hear geese flying overhead and be like, that's a snow goose. That's a specklebill. And that's just because of time and effort, right?
That is so magic to me because that level of observation of the natural world, like there are so many things I think that we're distracted by, going back to phones and just the noise of everyday life. And I think that that's maybe one of the reasons why people want to leave cities and move to quieter, more rural areas. But like, this is the next step. It's like going into the woods, observing the seasons. I wondered, as somebody that's so connected to the natural world and really witnessing it change throughout the seasons, if you've noticed in Arkansas, you're a part of Arkansas, that there have been shifts due to climate change of, the patterns changing, the bird patterns, the animal patterns, or weather patterns.
I mean, yeah, absolutely. I mean, specifically with ducks, which is like what Arkansas is kind of known for. Duck hunting in Arkansas is different than it was 10 or 11 years ago when I started. The migrations have changed. The number of birds have changed. And that's a result of climate change. That's a result of changes in agricultural practices. Winters, I mean, the South kind of had that big winter event last year, but like winters aren't as cold. So yeah, long story short, I've definitely seen impacts of climate change. And I'd say most hunters would admit that. They might differ on what they think the cause of it is, right? If it's influenced by human activity or if it's just a natural cycle.
Let's kind of transition over, because a lot of people that listen to this podcast are people who are living in cities right now. And I know that you made that transition in college to a smaller community, but I was really wondering, there's also been a huge influx of people from cities in the last 2 years going into rural communities. And I think that there is this real feeling of a divide in some communities right now. And I wondered, since you've lived there now for so long and have really built community, if you had any advice to new arrivals on ways to make friends, ways to weave themselves into the fabric of their community, ways to build bridges and not walls.
So I'll be real honest with you, right? And we've kind of talked about this before. There's a lot of walls right now, and if I'm being really truthful, I don't think they're going to get torn down anytime soon. So I would say go into it with your eyes open, right? Try and be participatory and not exploitive, right? You might have a lot more financial resources and it's nothing to be embarrassed or ashamed about, but there's a way to interact with people that don't have the same access to money, right? Move into a place respectfully, right? I mean, you can look at places like Jackson Hole, Wyoming, right? And look at what's happened with the influx of people and money and gentrification. You can see it in Hawaii. You can see it in Bozeman, Montana. You can see it in Northwest Arkansas, right? I don't really have an answer for all of that, but I would say just be aware of it and be respectful. So that'd be the first thing. I'd also say avoid the trap of thinking that you're smarter than people because you perceive them to have less formal education than you. And also just be careful who you're dealing with. I can tell you right now, in East Arkansas, there's a lot of folks that are multi-millionaires and you'd have no idea. They drive a truck that's 5 years old. They're wearing, dungarees and like Carhartt t-shirts and stuff. And especially in a small place like that, like they control the power structure, right? So just go into a space, I would say this goes across the board. You go into a new space, you act respectfully, conduct yourself with some humility, and then just listen more than you talk, right? I've been very mindful about that, buying a place in the town where my lodge is at, right? I've tried to be very, very mindful about not imposing myself upon anybody, building like real respectful relationships with people that have turned into friendships. I think spreading your money around helps out a lot too, right? So if you're going to hire electricians or builders or whatever, you find out the best people to do that locally, and you keep that money in the community, right? And I would tell you this, in a small place, one of the best ways to do that would be to go to like the mayor of whatever little town it is, right? Go to the leaders of the churches and go to the fire department. And then if you're inclined to go to places of worship and stuff, I think that'd probably be a huge way to bridge the gap. That'd probably get you sucked into the community faster than anything. And I think that you move to a place, folks seeing that effort, that goes a long way too.
People respect it and people will help you too. Like if someone sees you, I've interviewed so many people across the country for this project, and it is so respected by people in those communities when they see these new people move in and they like see them like hauling a plow through their field towed to the back of their minivan, and then they're like, let me show you some things. Let me help you because I see the effort and I know that you want to do this and I'm here to help.
Yeah, that's, you know what? I think that's your big bridge builder look, we haven't really brought it up, right? But like, obviously I look different than what a lot of people would think of when they think of a hunter, right? I live in Arkansas. I deal with a lot of stuff in rural Arkansas, right? I've got really great relationships with people that maybe I wouldn't naturally be inclined to deal with, and they wouldn't be inclined to deal with me. And the thing that has bridged that gap is that they see me bust my ass, and eventually that will ingratiate you to other people. But that's kind of few and far between. Most people will take you for what you're worth if you treat them, if you approach them with humility, if you treat them with respect, and they see that you work hard. Most people. Yes, I thoroughly agree with that. I'm just going to keep reading your writing because it's so ridiculously beautiful.
Oh, sure. And you just brought it up. And camo-clad and bleary-eyed like everyone else around me, I still look out of place to some under the flickering fluorescent lights of a 4 a.m. gas station stop. I get glances and double takes. Sometimes it's a knowing nod of sharing an identical pursuit. Sometimes it's a perplexity or bemused condescension. Occasionally there are glares. From time to time, I hear the familiar gut-wrenching words that clearly communicate to me that I am seen as an other, an outsider. Those are tense times and they can be dangerous. Should I puff my chest, or is discretion the better part of valor? What about pride? And what about survival? The considerations are endless and the decisions in these situations must be made quickly and often. All of it is exhausting. The constant remains that I am noticed. The anonymity so many other hunters enjoy escapes me. It's one more factor to consider whenever I go afield, and there's already enough to consider when you're hunting ducks in Arkansas. I'd love for you to speak on your experiences as a hunter of color, any of those unlikely alliances, any additional considerations or precautions you take, and any advice or words of encouragement to others who want to try their hand at hunting but might feel hesitant or fearful at what they might encounter.
Like, look, I'm not going to play this game to where I'm going to say like these differences don't matter, right? Because they do, and they impact people's lives. I'm painfully aware of it, right? It's one of the crosses I had to bear in life, right? I think as I've gotten older, as I've had daughters, I think as I've been able to listen to things that my wife has been telling me for a long time and maybe I wasn't able to hear before, and I've seen more points of connection with that. Like, I think there's probably a lot of considerations that I make in my daily life that are analogous to considerations that, ladies have to think about, right? Or LGBTQ folks, non-binary, whatever. And so I'd say we're probably never going to get to a point where you don't have to be aware, right? So you have to be aware. Someone told me the other day, they referred to it as like a colonial mindset of like personal growth, like fear therapy, exposure therapy, right? Like you can't exposure therapy me away from racism because it won't ever go away, right? Pay attention, right? What I think military folks say, like, keep an eye on your sixes or whatever, right? Situational awareness is important. I also think that, if you're dealing with these things, part of your path to strength is going to be not letting that be a determining factor in every aspect of your life, right? So by that, I mean, like, hunt with a buddy, maybe. Maybe that's what you need to do is hunt with a buddy. That's probably a good idea anyway, just because stuff can happen, right? But don't let other people's smallness or other people's bullshit stop you from being the person that you want to be, right? You have every right to be in those places. You have every right to feel and experience all these heady notions and romanticism that we're talking about, right? You are entitled to the self-discovery and the ripple effects that other people in your life will experience from those places of strength and capability and all that stuff, right? And it might require more out of you. It might require more internal fortitude than it does from somebody else who in some ways has an easier path or more infrastructure is laid out societally for them. I feel like we have the choice in life to decide what's going to stop us and what's not. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't continue to work towards a more egalitarian experience for everyone. I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about accepting these isms, and, like I said, other people's smallness. But I am saying you can't let that be a determining factor in how, in the fullness of your life, stand up for yourself, protect yourself, but go there. And that's also the only way that it's going to get better and easier for the folks coming after you, right? Like all that representation matters stuff. That's why representation matters. And it sucks that there's going to be, some of us are going to have to pave the way. It's a responsibility, possibly a burden. It's also an opportunity. It's stuff you're going to have to wrestle with. As I have found points of understanding and empathy with people that I didn't necessarily have before, because as I analyze my own experiences, I can see similarities in their experiences, right? So as I've gotten older, I've found like way more kinship in the experiences of women because of my experiences as a non-white person. And then that's a way to build a bridge, build relationships, all of that type of stuff. Somebody else's smallness, somebody else's evil even is not your responsibility. So only give it as much cause and concern as you have to stay safe, and then go get what you want.
I just wanted to give an enormous thank you to all of the listeners who have made contributions towards the production of this podcast. Every season, I spend about 100 hours preparing, writing, editing, interviewing, sketching, distributing, and I have hard costs for my editor and hosting fees. It means so much to me that you find enough value and meaning in this work to pledge your support to keep it going. If you haven't had a chance to contribute, we've made it really easy. Just click the support button on the top of urbanexodus.com and pledge any amount that you like. Or join the Urban Exodus Patreon community. Thank you again. I feel so lucky to be a part of the amazing global community that this project has manifested.
I'd love for you to talk a little bit about the work you do on a local level in terms of public land access and even private land access to hunt on, and why this is such an issue in the hunting community to have that access to land.
Public land in America is kind of like one of the great equalizers, right? And it's admittedly problematic because of how that land got in the public hands. Like it was taken from other people. And those are considerations and conversations that need to continue. That said, I think public access is a democratizing force. Like an organization I mentioned before, Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, that's an advocacy group for keeping public land in public hands, not allowing the divestiture that some politicians have tried with taking these wild places and putting them in privatized hands for, fossil fuels exploitation or whatever. And it's not, to be true, this is not just for human access, but this is, wildlife has to have a place to exist. Like we're never going to go back to pre-European settlement of America, right? We're probably never going to have the great American Serengeti again. But I think people in this country have absolutely seen, especially in the last 120 years since, you're really talking about Roosevelt, John Muir, these people that kind of started the conservation movement of this country, that it's even an inherently selfish enterprise to want these places, to want these wild animals to exist, to let them live and thrive and be part of the world that we live in, right? We're all enriched by that. It's better for everybody. It's better for the health of the ecosystem. And, well-managed and scientifically based hunting practices and angling practices are a management tool that allows us to coexist and to have renewable resources. And then we get, and then like the ethical and legal ramifications of how that's done are kind of built in pretty succinctly already. And then you can kind of personalize that as you see fit.
And I mean, even just from like a basic cost perspective, if you were to get into hunting, you think about what it would cost in our current systems to fill a freezer full of meat for the whole winter. Way more expensive than that. Yes, there's your time and the skill level and being out there that you add to that. But I think like the value add, it's similar to growing your own food, which I do every year. It's just like the value add of biting into a tomato that you've grown, biting into a steak that you yourself hunted and dressed and cooked. It's priceless in some ways.
It's totally different. I would say this, man, because you've asked a couple of questions about like people that are maybe interested in it. I always tell folks that you got to remember this too. And look, there's not time for this, but you can deep dive in the way animals see. Most animals are keen into movement much more than they are to like camo, right? A lot of camo is for human beings more than it is for animals. If you think about like the classic American hunter, you're thinking about somebody with like a floppy hat and a red checked shirt, right? So you don't necessarily need to have specialized equipment. If we're talking about what most people think of as hunting, is they think of hunting white-tailed deer in an eastern deciduous forest. So that's everything essentially from the Atlantic coast to the western edge of Arkansas, right? You could hunt most of that stuff with a 12 gauge shotgun. So if you're going to get one thing, I would tell you to get a 12 gauge shotgun. You can hunt deer with that. You can hunt deer. You can hunt bear. You could hunt, upland game species. You can hunt squirrels. You can hunt birds, anything, right? That's going to be like your utilitarian entry into the space. And so that's what I would tell folks to do that, invest time in becoming proficient, invest time in learning good, safe gun handling practices. Treat that thing like what it is, which is a tool. It's not a source of bravado. It's not a source of power. It's not a source of masculinity or virility, right? It's a tool that is designed to kill things, right? And so take that very seriously. Take it seriously when you're hunting. Take it seriously when you're storing it, you're transporting it, all that stuff. And look, most people they're not going to give their whole lives over to it like I have, and you don't have to. But there's a tremendous sense of self-empowerment that just comes from, like I said, being a participatory member in your own life. And yeah, man, put all that stuff on scale with like homegrown tomatoes, and you're looking at it the right way.
One of the things that I appreciate about you beyond so many things is that you have this real desire to study the history, the background, like the different practices of hunting. You're a scholar. I mean, you got a history degree in school. And part of that is, trying to honor the animal by using as many parts of the animal as possible and kind of studying and learning how to do that. I wondered, if you could share some of that historical research that you've done on kind of the foundations of hunting in the South in the United States. And if that research has made you feel more connected in some ways to like our ancestors, how we all started from these hunter-gatherer roots.
Specifically in the South, you have a lot of subsistence hunting. You have just people trying to make a way for themselves. That's across racial and ethnic lines. You also, if we're talking specifically about African Americans, during periods of enslavement, hunting was allowed or permitted in some very small controlled instances as a way to, fill the larders for enslaved people, basically not have the financial expenditure be as high for the plantation owners. So they'd send enslaved people out to hunt and fish as a way of providing protein for enslaved peoples. It was also, after abolition, it was also like a real source of economic empowerment and societal self-empowerment for formerly enslaved people. That kind of went hand in hand with the creation of vagrancy laws, Jim Crow laws, also the beginning of the conservation movement. So, that stuff is all intertwined, right? The idea of like it being Black people having guns being legislated, or not being able to have guns being legislated, that goes with it. Former slaveholders that were still plantation owners, like there's lots of public information writing about this, about them complaining about they couldn't get Black people to work for them because they were raising crops on their own, and they were hunting and fishing, like selling that stuff into the still legal meat market at the time. And so there were concerted political efforts to stop that, to force folks back into this controlled sense of labor. So you've got that going on. You also have, just straight up racism in conservation. So like the South was largely very resistant to the establishment of game laws, limits, just this North American conservation model. And what tipped the scales and got folks online with it is their understanding that it could be used as a means of controlling African American activities, right? So I think that's important. It's important to know some of these histories, especially when you start talking about these social tropes, like Black people don't hunt or Black people don't swim, right? Like if you look on any coastal country in Africa or any of the islands, the Caribbean islands, like Black people are born swimming, right? The reason there's a disassociation within America is because Black people were not allowed access to public beaches, lakes, rivers, and swimming pools, right? So you do that for a couple generations. You have grandma, grandpa, mom, dad have developed a fear of water because of a lack of exposure to it. And then it's this idea, right? Same thing with hunting. Now, you're also dealing with something, and I'm working on an article right now talking about Black hunters in the South and their access to public land. And, I've been hunting with and dealing with Black folks that have been hunting, their family's been hunting for successive generations, right? But it's also just that's not whose picture you see in magazines, right? You also have a population, like most of the Black people in this country still live in the South, right? Folks don't think about that. But most Black people still, like something like 55 or 58% live in the South. The South is a region where you still have a historical legacy of Black land ownership, continued Black access to agrarian lifestyles, right? And so you still have like a stronghold of that here in the South. Truthfully, for most of the history of Black people being in this country, they've been an agrarian people, right? They've been people who work with their hands, who work intimately with the land, largely coerced in nature, but still that's been the Black relationship with North America, right? So again, like it's not introducing non-traditional hunters or non-traditional peoples to a connection with natural processes. It's just reconnecting them with something that's already been there, right?
Yeah. And it's like systems of basically food apartheid and suppression that were created in order to separate people from the ability to take care of themselves so that control element could be reinstituted on a massive level. I wondered, from your perspective, what does the future of hunting hold in the United States and the world? I do feel like right now we're living in a time that feels like resources are getting smaller. People are feeling scared about the future. Do you think that hunting's going to increase in popularity, or have you seen a shift since, building your business? And do you think it will become more or less necessary in terms of food acquisition and also of animal control?
So, like, statistically, hunting is on a downswing in this country. I think you're dealing with something like 5% of Americans consider themselves hunters. Almost unilaterally across the country, every year there's fewer and fewer hunting licenses being sold. And that's a problem. It's a problem in a couple of different ways. A lot of people don't understand this, but like the vast, vast majority of wildlife conservation is funded by hunting, right? The whole reason that there are still elk, deer, squirrels, waterfowl in this country are because hunters wanted to preserve those species because they wanted to continue in these activities, right? That's why Yellowstone exists. Teddy Roosevelt, that was very, very, very unpopular. Roosevelt forced Yellowstone through. He forced the creation of the national park system through, right? There's something that a lot of people don't know about called the Pittman-Robertson Act, which says that every time hunting equipment is sold, and the way it's defined is that's any gun, any bullet. So like pistols, stuff that is not used for hunting, anytime that stuff is sold, there's a tax put on that, and that money goes to conservation agencies and the wildlife management agencies in the country, right? So as far as like, if you want wild places to exist, and look, a lot of people don't want to hear this, right? But hikers pay nothing into that. Backpackers pay nothing into it. I actually think that that should change, and they should put a tax like that on some of these activities so that we all have a stake in this. But if you want this stuff to continue, hunting has to continue, right? Hunting is not, and it's never been something that everyone's going to do. Like, even if we go back 10,000 years, everybody wasn't a hunter. You know, like hunters were, hunting was like a specialized thing. Now, everybody had a connection, an intimate connection to it. Everybody got their hands dirty. Like maybe the community or the tribe or the group of people, they helped butcher and all that stuff, right? You saw animals being broken down from whole animals into pieces, but it'll never be a thing where everybody does it. And truthfully, it wouldn't be sustainable, right? There's not enough game out there for everybody to do it. But what I'm seeing, what you're also seeing is that even though right now hunting is still largely white and male, a lot of those participants are dying out or they're aging out of it, right? And the people that are coming into it, the new people that are coming into it are people from urban environments, people of color, women, right? And that trend needs to continue and needs to grow. There's a difference between going out with purely the mindset of recreation and going out with this goal in mind too, right? So there's a difference in hunting and hiking, right? Even though hunting might be a lot of hiking, there's a difference in it. The way your brain is working is different. And I think too, it's worth noting that there's part of that is meditation and part of that is focus. And I think there's a lot of value in having both of those things. 2 years ago, I guarantee you, nobody thought they were going to be waiting in line to get into a grocery store. First thing I did was go and catch fish. When all that happened, I went and caught a bunch of catfish. And it actually took some of the stress away because, you know, I knew that I could keep us alive for another week just with catfish if I had to, right? It never came to that. I was never not able to go to the store and get food. It put my mind in a different place, right?
It made you feel like I got this, which is very empowering. When the first lockdown happened, I immediately just planted all my seeds and like started all of the greens in our windows. And it made me feel like I can take an active, tangible role in trying to, you know, of course, I'm not gonna be able to feed myself off of just like salad greens, but like, here is a step. And in this step is part of the calming, finding that center again. I have had such an incredible time talking to you, Jonathan. I could like literally talk to you forever. We've gone over time, so I'm just going to leave you with one more question. How do people support your work? How do they learn more about Black Duck Revival, listen to your podcast, take a workshop with you, rent your lodge?
Pretty easy. Just everything's Black Duck Revival. So on social media, it's just Black Duck Revival. Website's blackduckrevival.com. The podcast is the Black Duck Revival podcast. That's on all the Spotify's, Apple podcast platforms and the like. I'm starting a book for the spring. I'm booking fishing trips. In the fall, we'll have just like a handful of waterfowl trips. I'm also like available to come to you. So like if you have a camp or a lodge or just a collection of folks that are interested in it, like I can come to you. We can work on whole animal butchery. We can talk about like whole animal usage. We can talk about all this kind of stuff. And then in the coming months as well, there'll be a little bit more like filmography type stuff. So I'm going to start doing just more cooking tutorials that you can just watch and consume online. They'll be coming later in the spring. There'll be just like some more consumables. So like I've started making calls, and that's like a great way to support me as well. Like I've really tried to bring some stuff to the equation that isn't, I mean, like I'll be totally honest with you, man. Like you come like on a duck hunting trip with me, like it's going to cost 4 figures, right? Everybody doesn't have that. And I totally get it. So I want there to be ways for people to interact that, you know, don't cost, you know, a bunch of money if you don't have a bunch of money. And honestly, if you just like what I'm talking about and you want to support it, like just subscribing to that podcast helps out a ton. And that doesn't really take any effort at all, right? So like 5-star review, a subscription, a little nice written review. That helps me a lot because that lets my platform grow. That lets me monetize it in different ways. And yeah.
Thank you again, Jonathan, for joining us on the show. Some of my key takeaways from this episode. Paraphrasing Jonathan, growth comes from discomfort. So get comfortable with being uncomfortable in order to lead a more fulfilling life. And along with that, understand that participating fully in your life means going after what you want, despite the fear of the unknown. Comfort in all areas means standing on the sidelines. In any pursuit, gear can often be a distraction or create a mirage of a barrier to entry. Don't let it. Start with what you have. Know that knowledge, practice, and community can help you get to where you need to be, not expensive equipment. Wild foods, hunting, fishing, and foraging can all be intimidating pursuits if you didn't grow up with that knowledge. Seek out mentors, friends, family that you trust, and learn with grace, humility, and the willingness to work for what you want. And finally, disconnection is often the name of the game in our modern society. Fight against that. Continuously find ways to learn new skills and connect with your local ecosystem. Hi, friends. Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of the Urban Exodus podcast. This project is made possible by listener support. I do this work because the people I meet through this project give me hope for the future. And I think we could all use a little more motivation and inspiration in this current moment in history. All of the work that I do through this project is to encourage people to believe in themselves and to work towards a better future for their community and for our planet. Your continued support will keep this passion project running. The easiest way to contribute is to click the support button on the top of urbanexodus.com and pledge any amount that you like. Or you can buy an ad spot in an upcoming episode, shop our online store of rurally made goods, or join our Patreon community for access to bonus features, rapid-fire interviews with podcast guests, videos, live presentations, and so much more. Visit patreon.com/urbanexodus. Another way to support is by giving us a 5-star rating on iTunes and recommending Urban Exodus to your friends. Thank you again for helping me continue to do this work. I couldn't do this without all of you. You can find Urban Exodus on Instagram and Facebook at The Urban Exodus. To read more in-depth features on folks who ditched the city and went country, visit urbanexodus.com. Until next time, I'm Alyssa Hessler, and this is The Urban Exodus.